world do I want to live in? I think about this question a lot.
For our generation and for specifically my group of people, which is refugees, the circumstances might dismantle any vision of the future that we have.
You're trying to rebuild, you're trying to make a future for yourself, and then the climate-related disaster comes and you start again. It's not about how it's affecting you now, it's about how it's affecting you your entire life.
First step to understand is that we're all a part of it. None of us are going to be left out by the crisis.
We're at a stage where if we don't act now, really there won't be very much left.
There are generations that will never see certain things that we grew up seeing in real life.
We have to start treating this like the emergency it is. To achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we have to go from an intention to a serious commitment.
Business leaders really need to rethink how they conduct their business and invest in creating systems that are climate friendly.
The action I would like to see is accountability. Structures being put in place where countries aren't just asked to do something, but they're kept accountable to the decisions that they make.
There has to be that strong collaboration between government, between corporations, between youth activists to drive change forward.
The world I would want to live in is a world where imagining the future is not a privilege.
I want to live in a world where people do not give up on hope that a positive change is possible.
The fact that you're listening today means that you are willing to make a change.
Good morning, everyone. So we are here, which I would dare to say it's probably one of the most, or maybe the most important session of this forum, which is turning words into action. So this amazing group of young people here will tell you about their stories, about their messages, about their lives, about why they're here in Davos. So thank you for coming this morning. I think it's very important that you also bring this message with you to the society, to the people that are not here. There are also people looking and watching with us. So my name is Ilona. I'm just going to say a few words because the floor is theirs today. But I think we're also here because we know that the world is reaching various tipping points as we grip with this triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution. So for instance, in a place that is very close to my heart, the Amazon forest, we're almost crossing a threshold of deforestation that could just turn the forest into a savanna. So destroying the whole ecosystem, disrupting rain cycles, and also warming temperature with planetary implications. I'm sure we all read the most recent IPCC reports that are a reminder of the systemic risks of global warming due to greenhouse gas emissions, including in the atmosphere, land, oceans, and all ecosystems and biodiversity on the planet. So the latest report tells us a lot of messages, but just to highlight a few. To different extents, we will all suffer the consequences of the climate breakdown, as about half of the world's population live in areas highly vulnerable to climate change. And if we don't get on track to limit global warming to the Paris Agreement's target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the impacts will be irreversible and catastrophic. And it's important to just bear in mind that millions of people today face food and water shortage just owing to the already rising temperature. So this is a crisis that is true today and that can just get worse in the next years if we don't act. But we're here to act. So if we cross this limit, which won't happen, we will also accelerate many other crises, which will jeopardize the well-being of young people and multiple generations yet to be born. So it's very important for us to be clear that time is running out, and the actions we take today are hugely consequential. They will not just affect the young people that are sitting here and that everywhere in the world, but they will affect all future generations. So world leaders need to start delivering instead of postponing. So we need to keep, at the very least, global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and fully implement the Paris Agreement and advance on what is being called the Paris Agreement for Nature. So the good news is, despite the compounding challenges ahead, we also have commitments, and that if implemented, can avoid these irreversible tipping points. So to transform commitments to reduction of carbon emissions and protecting our natural resources into concrete actions, we need to take the last chance to avoid the worst. And I'm sure this chance is emerging from the strength of young people across the globe. So we need to provide the largest cohort of young people in history, about 1.8 billion young people today in the world, the opportunities to be truly part of the process as active agents and not as passive actors. So that's why I'll stop talking here. We can hear from them about what could we do differently. And I want just to briefly introduce this panel. So we have Elena Gualinga, Youth Ambassador from the Arctic Base Camp. Elena is from Ecuador. We have Cassidy Milgrock-Kramer, a Youth Ambassador also from the Arctic Base Camp. She's from the US, from Alaska. Then we have Jeremy Antoine Hagen, Global Shaper from the Victoria Hub in the Seychelles. He's from the Seychelles. We also have Vanessa Nakate, founder of the Rise Up movement. Vanessa is from Uganda. And then we have Taylor Hawkins from the Advisory Council of the Global Shapers Sydney Hub from Australia. So just to start this discussion, we're going to have questions for the panelists, and then we're going to open also for your questions. So start thinking about what you want to ask this incredible group that we have here with us. And just to start, I wanted to really know why you're here today. What brought you here? Just tell us about your stories and what you'd like these people to know about. Let's start with just Elena beside me.
Thank you. I come from the Amazon rainforest, but from the Ecuadorian part of the Amazon rainforest. The place where I come from is usually known as the headwaters of the Amazon. So everything that happens in my part of the Amazon affects the entire water system of the Amazon basin. So that means it affects Ecuador, it affects Peru, it affects Brazil, and all the other Amazonian countries. I come from an indigenous community. I come from the Quechua people of Sarayaku. My community has a long history of fighting oil companies and in general, the extractivism. We have a very strong opposition to, for example, road building, because that only brings extractivism to our communities. But 20 years ago, exactly the same year I actually was born, an oil company tried to enter my community without my community's consent. And my community immediately said, no, we're not going to let you drill oil here, because we had already seen the devastating effects oil drilling would have in the Amazon, and it would have on our population, on our culture, on our identity, on our livelihoods. We had seen how people could no longer drink their water just a little up north from us, how children would have burns and rashes on their bodies because of the oil, because of the pollution that was in their environment. But in Ecuador, back then, there was no such thing as respecting indigenous people's rights, or our decision, or what we actually wanted in our communities. So my community knocked on every door that existed in Ecuador to find help, to be able to protect our territory. We're a community of around 1,200 people. Back then, it was even less. But we are the custodians of 140,000 hectares of pristine Amazon rainforest. Because no one in Ecuador was interested in supporting this, after a 10-year battle, after 10 years of living with threats against the lives of our leaders in the community, after political persecution, after intimidation, My community of 1,200 people were able to take the Ecuadorian government to an international court of human rights and actually win. This set a very important legal precedent in Ecuador and across Latin America when it comes to indigenous people's rights. So that's one of the reasons why we've been able to see some more victories in the Amazon, especially in Ecuador, because of this one case that happened now 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean that the threats have stopped. We have this extra layer of protection that we were able to keep the oil companies out from our territories. But that doesn't mean that our neighbors' territories are being respected. That doesn't mean that other extractive industries are not trying to enter our communities. The Amazon rainforest is one of the most important ecosystems of this planet, and we still have governments that are trying to exploit it. We have the industries that are trying to come in there, and these places are a direct connection to our identities and to our livelihoods, which is the reason for why indigenous people have been protecting it for so long. This year, mining expanded horribly in Ecuador, both legal and illegal mining. Logging and also oil drilling there's a new oil boom coming in Ecuador. The Ecuadorian government is planning to double oil production per day, and this means that we don't really know where is this oil going to come from. That means that in a couple of months we're going to be facing more threats to our territories. We don't know if it's going to be me, or if it's going to be my cousin's territory, or if it's going to be a friend's territory. But we know that they are coming to the Amazon again. Ecuador has between 2 to 5 oil spills per week. This all happens in indigenous territories and in the Amazon. And usually we don't even talk about this because we have normalized the violence towards indigenous people. We have normalized treating the environment and nature like that. We have normalized having oil spills and having pollution in our waters so much that when oil spills happen 2 to 5 times per week, we don't even talk about it. We talk about it when it's the worst oil spill that we've seen in decades, and that is actually what we saw last year. We've had 2 of the worst oil spills since the Texaco Chevron oil spill happening in the Ecuadorian Amazon last year. We have family across the entire Amazon in my country, and our family would send us pictures of how their children had rashes on their bodies because when the oil spills occurred, neither did the government and neither did the oil companies inform the people that the oil spill had occurred. In just 2 days, the oil had reached Peru, and that's what I'm saying. What happens in the headwaters of the Amazon affects the entire Amazon and the entire ecosystem of the Amazon. But it does not only affect us in the way of polluting our waters. We can no longer hunt, for example, because of this, because the oil goes inland. The oil and the water, it reaches a huge region of the Amazon rainforest. And you know, as many other governments, our government is a government that's trying to profile themselves and creating this image of a green government that is completely false. There's this huge hypocrisy in what actually goes on in the ground and what's, for example, being brought to spaces like this. And yeah, it's you know, really, it's going to be a really tough year for the Amazon, for indigenous people. The people that are going to be protecting this are always indigenous people. And that is why it's crucial to actually guarantee indigenous peoples the rights, the human rights, the basic human rights, but also make sure that when we're protecting our forests, when we are organizing, when we are being active against these threats, that our lives are not put at risk. And I'm sure we can go more into that.
Many points that I'm sure we're going to go back to them. What I just wanted also to ask you, Ilona, is like, what's the name of your people?
Quechua. Kichwa of Sarayaku.
Thank you so much. Cassidy, please, just introduce yourself and tell also like why you're here.
Yeah, I'm Cassidy Miller-Kramer. I'm an Inuk from the Arctic, and I'm here just because the Arctic is not heard in these spaces. Many people forget about the Arctic and about the people in the Arctic, and I don't think that's fair because we are going through a lot of loss. Not only loss in sea ice, but loss in animals, loss in land due to permafrost melting, but also loss in people, and that comes from a loss of culture due to climate change, warming, and so the youth not engaging in their culture, I think, is really having a toll on mental health in the area, and so, you know, there's a lot of suicides, there's high rates of suicides, and, you know, I think that these voices need to be heard in the Arctic, and they need to be brought to these spaces, just because, you know what's happening there, it's not going to stay there. You're not going to be able to stay away from that forever. It's going to catch up to you. So that's what I'm here, is bringing the Arctic to you guys.
Thank you so much. We're going to go to Jeremy, and I'm sure we have so much to dig into all these issues that are being raised here. We'll go back to you, Cassidy, as well. Jeremy, please.
Thank you so much for the space. As someone from a large or big ocean state, an African big ocean state like the Seychelles, I'm trying my best to represent small island states, big ocean states from also the Caribbean, also from the Pacific, because we all share special circumstances when it comes to oceans, climate change, and sustainable development. The communities back home that I know and have met are losing their land, losing their futures, and will be stateless in decades to come if we aren't able to keep emissions well below 2 degrees, hopefully at 1.5. And when you hear the World Meteorological Organization say there's a 50% chance that we'll be passing 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years, we have to ask ourselves what words have been said, have the commitments been met and fulfilled, what actions have come. So trying to bring the ocean, trying to bring the communities and peoples and entire countries that will be lost in our lifetimes if we're unable to really take things to where they're meant to be, turn words into action. I'm also trying as a global shaper to really represent youth who are not only experiencing a lot of these issues, but also coming up with solutions, also working with other youth and intergenerationally to come up with solutions so that we're not only victims, but we're also champions. So I'm trying my best to bring that community.
Sure, you're big champions, and I think the role of youth is something that, if I would say what makes me optimistic, is you. And I'm going to go, I know that's a lot of responsibility, we're going to talk about that as well, but I want to talk, just listen a little bit about Vanessa, and we'll continue here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I come from Kampala in Uganda. It's a country that has one of the fastest changing climates in the world, and I'm really here to talk about the urgency of the climate crisis and how it's affecting the communities in Uganda and also communities across the African continent. We know that Africa historically is responsible for less than 4% of the global emissions, and yet many people are suffering some of the most brutal impacts of the climate crisis. And we've seen this really unfold with floods and droughts and, cyclones and all the climate disasters. And of course, this means loss of livelihoods, loss of farms, loss of businesses, destruction of schools, and all other related challenges. So there is a need to really highlight the emergency of the climate crisis and the communities that are already on the front lines, and the immediate action that we need to address the climate crisis.
So much, Vanessa. And I think you touch on issues also of climate justice that we want to explore more. And now to you, Taylor.
I'd actually love to start by acknowledging the emotional labor of all of the other panelists that I get to sit here with, because coming from an Australian context, yes, our country is on fire, but we are also a perpetrator on the global stage. And I sit here with the hope that I can be proud to be Australian again soon, because I attended COP26 last year and that was not my experience. So I hope to listen a lot on this panel. I hope to truth tell on behalf of my country, and I hope to learn a lot from these other incredible people.
Taylor. And I think we all understand the urgency. And you're here in Davos, and I think this is a unique opportunity to communicate your messages. I think to the citizens that are here with us, but to the world leaders that are also listening to you. So before we dig in on how to just change things, like what would be your first call to action to your peers here and to world leaders that are, should just be turning words into action?
For me, it's pretty simple. I could put it in one sentence. Phase out from fossil fuel. It's, as I said, that is what's causing climate change. There is one big issue that we have, and that is fossil fuel. That's the fossil fuel industry. But we've been living on territory with the consequences of this industry, directly feeling the environmental consequences of what this industry is doing. And right now, we're also feeling the consequences of climate change. The social disruptions that have been because of this industry, because of climate change. This industry has been causing so much harm, and it is affecting the people that have benefited the least from the system and from that industry. Yeah.
Cassidy.
Yeah. I would say that there needs to be nature-based solutions in the Arctic, just like in Ecuador and the Amazon. Oil is a big thing in Alaska, and although it provides a lot of jobs, it's not going to be there forever. And I think the most stable way to kind of ensure our future is to invest in nature-based solutions and invest in bettering the earth. Because I think when you put money into something, it's going to win. So I believe putting money into bettering the earth is going to win.
Jeremy.
I definitely agree about keeping it in the ground, invest in nature-based solutions, and add that there's been a lot of lies, a lot of commitments made, so let's not make new commitments without actually genuine action following, but let's actually fulfill the commitments that have already been promised. We have COP27 in November. We have meetings in Bonn in a couple of days. There's a huge amount of crises, and it's not a zero-sum game always. But I believe that we really need to turn those commitments that we promised in Glasgow, at least, or we promised in 1992 with the UNFCCC in Paris. These are all, in some cases, commitments made decades ago. So how are we fulfilling these commitments? Why are we not fulfilling these commitments?
Your message.
Yeah, I also think there is really a need to move from promises to real action from government leaders and also business leaders. And that will look like not investing in any new fossil fuel projects, because we've seen the harm that fossil fuels are causing in so many communities across the world. And there is a need to support a just transition to cleaner and renewable energy for communities, not leaving out the communities that are on the front lines. So making clean energy accessible and also affordable for the communities that are on the front lines. I think there is also a need to address loss and damage that is already happening right now, because as the climate crisis escalates, it's pushing many communities to places where they cannot adapt anymore, because when it comes to extreme dry conditions and extreme droughts, many people they're pushed to a place where they cannot access food, for example. So people cannot adapt to starvation, and as the climate crisis escalates, people are losing their cultures, so they can't adapt to the loss of their cultures or their identities or their histories attached to the places where they're staying. So there is really a need to address loss and damage, and that will look like acknowledging that loss and damage is happening right now, and also putting money in place for loss and damage. There's been a demand for climate finance for a long time, and we know that $100 billion was promised for the vulnerable nations, but it hasn't yet been delivered. So there is really a need to provide climate finance, especially for those on the front lines, and a compensation fund or a loss and damage facility to be put in place. And the demand is for this to be in form of grants and not in form of loans, because that will add on already existing debts. So I think, those are some of the things that we really need to address when it comes to this conference.
Vanessa, many important points there. Taylor?
I certainly hold out hope that COP later this year has a strong focus on loss and damage, and I think a lot of the great points have already been made. I think we need to raise our standards in leadership. We need to expect more of ourselves and of each other. So much of what we're seeing, to the point of pledges being made and not delivered, targets being made without roadmaps, with the expectation that another leader will take the mantle of when that target comes to pass. We need to realize that we need to be looking at a longer time scale and hold responsibility for the results that will come after our term, after our lifespan, after our leadership term. And I say that as a young leader. I hope that leaders currently in the most senior positions start to think about that, which is why one of the things I'm advocating for is future generations infrastructure. So specific entities, specific initiatives whose job is to look at what is the long-term impact of the policies we're making, the failed pledges, the choices that we're making, and the priorities that we're putting in place.
So much, Taylor. I think Vanessa just mentioned a point that should just be more developed here. So I think we were discussing also about the right to development, because many of these countries that are facing already the worst impacts of climate change are developing countries, are vulnerable communities that many places we talk about climate change and they say, but we also have the right to develop. And I think the model that we're discussing has to shift. So what can be done to change this paradigm of development? I think Vanessa brought a full script there, but if we could dig in, and feel free to just to add, what do you think could be really done to allow the right development to flourish and people to have the right to live in dignity, but knowing that we have to protect our planet so we can protect ourselves? So feel free to just come as you feel, just to add to the discussion.
We have this false idea of what development looks like, right? So when I was younger, when all of this was happening in my community, what they told us was, no, but this is for your development. So we're bringing this to you so you can develop, because you need to develop. You live in a remote place in the rainforest. You have the need to develop. That's what they told us. So for me, development was never a good word, and until I actually learned what it's supposed to mean. So there is this need of shifting the meaning of what development looks like. So development right now it's the oil spills, it's cutting down the forest, it's extraction, it is harming the planet. And there is this need of shifting that into actual development for communities that are specific for different communities, for different cultures, for different regions, because development is not going to look the same in every part of the world. Development for me is one thing, development for you is another thing, because we don't have the same realities. We live in different regions, we live in different environments, we live with different cultures. So development for my community, we have a very strong opposition to road building. So if you want to get to my community in the Amazon rainforest, you either go there by a canoe or you can fly in. But we have a very strong opposition against the road building. Because what road building means, which many people would say, well, that will bring you, you can export things. You could, it will be easier to travel. That's going to bring you a lot of development, a lot of good to your community. But what it actually will bring us is more illegal logging. It will bring us a lot of bad industries into our territories. There will be a disruption in our culture and our social environment. And that is not development. We have our own idea of what development will look like in our community, and that is something that we're already working on in our community. We're working to improving education in our community, an education that is based on indigenous ancestral knowledge, and how to combine that, for example, with Western knowledge. We are monitoring our territories to make sure that we can actually have a conservation on our territories that is not a Western idea of conservation, but that actually is relevant to our livelihoods and our cultures and our ways of living. We are adapting to the new realities of that our territories and the Amazon rainforest is shrinking because of extractivism, and we're adapting to all of these new changes. You know, 2 years ago, my community had faced one of the biggest natural disasters that we've seen in my region in the Amazon. A huge flood happened, and 80% of my community was affected. A lot of my family members lost their homes, lost everything they had. A really, really tragic event that occurred, and we still haven't been able to recuperate from that entirely. All the schools were taken by the flood. As I said, family homes, animals, the main bridge that connects our community is still not built, actually. But we as a community were able to face that crisis because even though we're traversing really hard times as such an event, as a natural disaster of that magnitude, we knew where we are going and what we want to have in our community. And that is the most important thing with development, actually respecting the realities of those regions where we want development. And I do think that this is really important because when they came to our communities and talked about development, and they still do, development, but how do we justify the human rights violations, the deprivation of the right to a good life with the word development? Is it justifiable? It's not.
I think there are many other ways to do that, but I just want to complement one thing you said, because it's true that in the Amazon, when you open roads, there's where the biggest deforestation comes. So, and the region is so full of rivers that we could just really think just creatively and do, boats and do fluvial area. But I mean, of course, there's trade-offs there, but what you're saying is backed by evidence. It's not only your feeling, it's what happens on the ground. So anybody else would like to jump into, like, what kind of development, what can we do to change today's paradigm?
If I can add, and I think speaking from a place in Seychelles where, we have recently protected 30% of our ocean. So Seychelles is only 100,000 people, a bit less. Yet we have an ocean territory the size of South Africa, 1.4 million square kilometers. And the area we've protected is about the size of Germany, give or take. And 15% of that, of the total, half of the 30% is a no-take, very place where there'll be only research and very strict conservation going on, and 15% sustainable use. where there's tourism and other activities taking place. And when you protect nature like that, when you conserve nature like that, it gives back more than you could ever hope. It regenerates, it's allowed to do that. It feeds people, there's spillover from these protected areas. We've protected 50% of our terrestrial area as well. And for a small island country, that is not simple. That means being able to put ourselves at risk by having 85% of our infrastructure on the coast. Critical infrastructure, we're talking about schools, we're talking about utilities, ports, airports. And so we decided a long time ago to do this to protect our forests, which give us water on an island. That's not simple, but making sure they have water throughout the year, ensuring that we have places for what we call ecosystem services, whether it's recreation for our children, our people. So when we think about trust with nature, an ability to ensure that we are not killing it, we're respecting it, it gives back more than we could ever hope. That's key to remember. But I think when we are a small island developing state, a big ocean state, and we see others, the developed countries, not fulfilling their commitments, we ask ourselves, how are we able to meet our goals when it's so hard and others aren't able to meet their goals? There is some help, there is some action, but when we find one UNESCO site I was working on, when we find over 500 tons of plastic pollution, of which most of it is fishing gear from distant fishing fleets, when we find that much plastic pollution on our shores, killing our biodiversity, what are we supposed to do? When we're faced with climate change and we're unable to get this finance from institutions, even if there's been a lot of commitments and some pledges met, it's very difficult for least developed countries, African countries, big ocean states, small island developing states access these funds. It takes years and years and a lot of capacity to write the right grants and proposals, and they come with so many conditions we have to co-finance. It's not one case where 50 million, 100 million is given and that's it. The government, private sector in these countries also have to put money into these projects. So when we think about development, we need to see assistance, we need to see nature protected. I highly agree when we talk about loss and damage, there's a limit to adaptation. If it goes 2 degrees, 90% of corals are gone. When we talk about Seychelles and tourism, a lot of it is on our beaches, on our corals. The pandemic showed us that 70% of our tourism, 70% of our economy is tourism. When the pandemic struck us in many small island states, our income was gone overnight. So how do we build resilient economies and how do we depend on ourselves? And nature is a big part of that. Recognizing the loss and damage is a big part of that. And I believe strongly that development for small island developing states and other countries that are vulnerable, it's a lot about adaptation and learning lessons from maladaptation, which came out clearly in the recent IPCC reports. There's a lot of maladaptation that has happened, and nature-based solutions are a really great way to show us what can be done when we trust in nature for adaptation.
Thank you so much. Anyone else would like to comment on that?
Yeah, I also think that development should really be defined by the people in the communities, because many times this development that is defined by investors, for example, from the global north, it is in their own interests. And when they talk about economic progress or, jobs for the people, in the end, it's in their own interests. The profits are always repatriated, and the communities are left with destruction, they're left with loss. And we are seeing many of the governments in the West claiming to be climate leaders. However, they are exporting their emissions in other countries, in other communities, by building more fossil fuel infrastructure and claiming that they are bringing economic progress for the people. And I can talk about the East Africa crude oil pipeline that is to be constructed by Total in my country, and it will go through to Tanzania. But this is a pipeline that is going to go through, you know, one of the largest national parks in the country, and also it's going to go through over 200 rivers in the country. And a third of the pipeline is going to go through the Lake Victoria Basin. Lake Victoria is the largest inland freshwater lake in Africa, and about 40 million people depend on it for water, for food, and also for their sources of income. So there is really a worry about, you know, oil spills and how wildlife is going to be impacted, and how, you know, the habitats and the biodiversity is going to be impacted because of the pipeline. However, these companies like Total, they do lots of marketing, and they make it look like they are going to provide jobs and economic development. So it even makes it hard for the people who are saying no to the pipeline, because it's like you are a small group of people against a huge number of people in your country, because they have been told that they are bringing economic progress. But we've seen how infrastructure, you know, developments, especially of fossil fuels in Africa, have ended up fueling, you know, human rights abuses, fueling challenges in these communities, poverty, you know. So it's not always for the development of these communities. In the end, it's for the interests of the companies from the West that claim to take this development. So there's really a need to tell the truth about fossil fuel companies, and also to really hold them accountable for lying to the public about their intentions, and yet they have caused harm, you know, in so many other communities. So again, development, I think, should really be defined by the communities and by telling the communities the truth.
Vanessa is raising a very important point, because we're seeing today, I mean, we learned from COVID that we are all interdependent. And we're seeing today, you know, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we can do a leapfrog. We can think about a transition that, you know, goes, let's say, speeds up the way out of fossil fuels. So we need to make sure that what is being learned here also goes to the developing world, and that they don't just transfer, you know, let's say, the damages to another part of the world, because unfortunately that's part of our history. And I think, Vanessa, you just put it very beautifully in how you explained. So anyone else, because there are many other issues to explore, but feel free to comment on this one as well.
Yeah, I would like to comment. Just to relate to Helena, there were people who came to my community and were saying, you know, this is how you should do development. This is what you should do. But in reality, we were already developed. You know, these communities already had structure, and, you know, they're genius people living inside of them. They're engineers, they were doctors, teachers. And so I believe just the way that they came and told us, like, this is what you should do, it just caused loss and damage. So I think, you know, as going into the future and just globally going off the topic of development, I would just like to say that you need to work with the indigenous peoples, the local indigenous peoples, in collaboration with them, or else you're just going to set it back. You know, you're just going to cause loss and damage, and there's not going to be any you know, success in that.
I want to go back to indigenous people, but maybe Taylor, do you want to comment on something?
I just wanted to say that if the Western concept of development was perfect, we wouldn't need this panel. And I think that speaks for itself. I know examples from my home in Australia. Had we worked effectively with our indigenous population, who have effectively stewarded our land for over 60,000 years, we would not have had the fires that we did. And that is evident on many, many fronts. And so I completely agree with what's being said, is that there's wisdom in communities, and communities know how to develop themselves. And so we need to make sure that we're not taking paternalistic approaches to people who are experts in their own communities and spaces.
Thank you so much. And I mean, we all touched the indigenous people's issue differently, and traditional populations. And what we see also is that the places in the world that are more pristine, they're more like conserved, are the places where indigenous people are. So they, you know, it's also, again, we don't want to put the responsibility of them being the guardians of the forests and the, you know, our earth systems, but it ends up happening that way. So could you tell us a bit more, because I think Ilona brought it very strongly, but a bit more of what should we do to protect these peoples, because many times they're also in the front lines. So I'm just personally engaged with some amazing young female indigenous leaders from Brazil, and they are, you know, being intimidated, they're being threatened because of the level of pressure that their communities are facing. And it's, let's say, it's something that I many times don't sleep well, because I know that they're not protected, and we don't have, let's say, institutionality in place today to make sure their voices, their rights, and their, you know, their lives are there. So what would you say that leaders could do to protect indigenous people and to just try to learn from you?
I think, yeah, as you said, there are really small efforts from institutions to protect indigenous people, even though we know the risk that indigenous people run for being activists, for being forest defenders, land protectors. But there is one certain topic I can touch on here, and it's the financial institutions, because our governments, unfortunately, many of our governments, it's not in their best interest to protect indigenous people, or that's how they see it. So there is very little guarantee from our governments, and of course we should be pushing for policy change, we should be pushing for more rights within our own countries, and that is extremely, extremely important. But there is also a responsibility on the financial institutions that, for example, finance oil, that finance the extractive industries and companies. And a lot of times, you know, in these spaces, they talk about the ESGs, and there's become more awareness and improvement in the E part of that, but very little on the S part, on the social, in the social part. And that is a huge responsibility on the financial sector when it comes to indigenous people's rights, because many big banks and corporations and financial institutions work directly with companies, even though they're not funding a certain project that's harming, they're still working with these companies. So what are they doing to keep hold these companies accountable? Do they have policies within their institution that guarantees that no harm is done to indigenous people? There's very little of that today, and they hold a huge responsibility, because even though they're not with their hands harming, they're complicit in the harm that is being done. Something else that you mentioned is the indigenous women, and my sister always says this, indigenous people have this experience of what violence looks like, but indigenous women have this even more profound experience of what it is to be an indigenous woman facing all of this violence. It's, you know, being an indigenous woman defender is extremely dangerous in Latin America, in North America, across the world. And I just want to highlight that, you know, there's this really powerful statistic of indigenous people making up 5% of the world's population, but protecting 80% of biodiversity. But women in our communities are the custodians of the lands. Women are the ones that are directly connected to the lands, taking care of the lands, working on the lands. And that role of women is so important to highlight, because there are no guarantees for indigenous women in almost all countries to make sure that our rights are respected, that there is safety, that there are opportunities, so yeah, there's this huge responsibility both in the governmental sector, on the private sector, and of course we should be pushing for change in all of those spaces.
Couldn't agree more with you. Anyone else would comment on that? Vanessa?
Yeah, I would like to comment on that. I think there is really a need to respect indigenous wisdom and indigenous knowledge, because I feel like that is, you know, the beginning of understanding what indigenous communities are doing and why their rights need to be respected. I can give, you know, a personal example of wildlife and, you know, wildlife conservation from, you know, where I come from. My tribe is called Baganda tribe, and we have like different clans, and personally I am from the elephant clan. So what this means is that if you are from the elephant clan, then you cannot harm an elephant, you cannot eat an elephant. Like, you do everything to ensure that it is protected. And the people within the elephant clan are like your brothers and sisters. And it's the same thing with other clans. You will find someone maybe, you know, in a clan of a specific fish species or any animal species or tree species. So these clans were put in place for, you know, that relationship of sisterhood and brotherhood, and also to preserve, you know, the different tree species and the different animal species and the different marine species. So you will find that if, for example, for plants, I share with someone, if someone's clan is like the mushroom clan, then they cannot eat the mushrooms. You know, if it's a certain kind of fish, they cannot eat that. And that has been a way of preserving the different animals and fish and, you know, the different trees and plants in my, you know, in my tribe. So I think there's really a need to respect the knowledge from, you know, the different tribes, and also to embrace it, because it has been able to protect, you know, different wildlife for so many years.
Thank you so much. So important. Like, how do we capture this wisdom to today's and to our lives every day? So, sure, Jeremy. Because then after we're going to go to the audience. I feel that they also want to talk to you.
I'm just building on what's been said, especially being here in Davos. If many of the participants, developed countries, developing countries, private and government, if they recognize the ecosystem service, what we've just heard in terms of the hundreds, the thousands of years in which this environment has been protected, there's a huge debt owed, so that all these companies, all these states can make profit, can have a tremendous power. When you hear about the being able to devolve power and give it representatives, people who are in touch in nature give nature a voice. They're able to talk about preserving it in a way because it's part of their daily lives. And the debt that it's owed to those people for managing these resources, for ensuring, if you go across Africa and other parts, other continents, in terms of the megafauna that remains today, when we're talking about tourism, when we're talking about all these different ecosystem services, I mean, fisheries, we can go on and on, regulation of climate change, there's a tremendous debt to these people who have managed these resources effectively. In the last 300 years, with colonization, with other things, industrialization, we've forgotten the people who are in touch with nature, and they really represent nature in a very, very personal, in a very, very effective way. And I just would like to echo what's just been said, because it's very important.
Thank you very much. So I would just like to open the floor to questions from the audience. Please, you there?
First, thank you all so much for the work that you're doing. So Cassidy, Jeremy, and Vanessa mentioned the importance of investing. So on that topic, I'm curious if the panelists have any insights around what metrics or data points investment managers can utilize in order to effectively allocate capital to companies that are positively impacting climate change, keeping in mind Helena and Vanessa's point that the data and communication may not always be accurate.
Yeah, and some things we're still learning how to measure as well. But let me just, do you have any ideas on that?
For my sake, and it's really interesting, I think the former governor of the Bank of England made a very strong case in terms of, in speaking maybe to the fossil fuel industry, which has oil rigs, and I would say critical infrastructure that will be affected by climate change. If you're a shareholder in this company and you realize that your company or the company you've invested in is contributing tremendously to the problem, but is also going to be vulnerable to the problem, how can you invest in that? I think that's going to be something that isn't going to be spread easily into simple, digestible math and metrics, but you can clearly see over decades, you can clearly see that this is not profitable in the long run. This is destruction of itself. This is cannibalism in a certain way. So I don't have all the math on me. I think there's plenty that far more advancing in economics and finance, but it's shown, especially with the subsidies and everything that's been given, these things aren't profitable.
And just to echo off of that, how the fossil fuel industry is not profitable, just about how the earth is. You know, he said that the earth regenerates itself. Like, you know there's going to be benefits in that. You know there's going to be profit in that. It may take time, but there will be. And there will be none in the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, I also think that when it comes to really investments, it should be investments that really prioritize the planet, but also prioritize the lives of the people, and really ensure that people can not only get into a present and future that is sustainable, but even their own lives are improved. For example, one of the things that I personally talk about that really needs investment is education of girls and women empowerment, and it's a climate solution. And this is because Project Drawdown lists 100 things that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and most often education is listed among the top 10 solutions, and it's often ignored. So there is a need for, you know, business leaders to really invest in not only the planet, but also to invest in the people. So education of girls is something that, you know, can be invested in, because it will reduce existing inequalities that so many girls and women face across the world, as we know that the climate crisis disproportionately affects women and girls. It will build resilience of individuals, of communities, and the world at large, and also reduce greenhouse gases, you know, all at the same time. So I think investment should be directed towards building, you know, individuals, communities, and protecting the planet. I also think there is a need to direct investments towards grassroots projects, because, you know, many times leaders are looking for companies that are doing something, but many times these companies are just greenwashing and showing that they're doing something, and yet they're actually pretending that they're doing something. So I think there is also a need to invest in grassroots projects that are already transforming, you know, the lives of the people in their communities. Many times the access of funds or financial resources, it's very hard for grassroots projects to get these kinds of support. So I think there is really a need for business leaders through their foundations to support grassroots projects that are already transforming their communities.
One thing I'd also just add to what you said, Vanessa, is if we're looking to move from being of the problem to of the solution, I think we need to see how many lenses we're looking through and really say, okay, who designed the metric? Who's collecting the data? Who's analyzing it? And do we have the voices in the room who can adequately say, exactly to your point, that education is essential, but that it's so often left out? And that's because those voices aren't being heard in how those measures are being designed. So I would say, yes, it's about the metric, but in turn, there are so many well-intended leaders who have created very negative consequences because they have been trapped within their own lens and within their own view of the world. So I think it also starts with the inclusion of the design and the implementation of whatever metric is selected.
So much. So there's a question here, another there. So maybe we take 2 questions and come back to the panel, so we try to do more rounds.
Thank you. Vanessa, you've attended the World Economic Forum 2 years ago already, and you had a very hurtful incident. I'd like to know, how does it feel to be back in Switzerland, and does the incident still play a role for you?
Maybe just go ahead, Vanessa, and then I'll just pass to you.
Okay. Well, of course, I am being constantly asked about the incident, and what I really see from that is the need to really highlight the voices of those that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and the need to really listen to every activist. You know, I don't like always drawing back to that incident because of how frustrating it was, but there is really a need to understand that every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. However, at the forum, of course, there is less representation of youth activists that I'm seeing, and also the other thing that I've seen from the forum in some of the meetings I've been in, most of the conversations are about economic growth, you know, GDP. I'm not hearing conversations about the climate crisis. So it's kind of really frustrating to think that there is so much conversation about how we are going to increase our profits and nothing about how we are going to protect our environment. And to be, you know, specific, there is an event I was at, and the whole conversation was just about, you know, GDP, and also just about the interests of the global north. And it was so frustrating because no one was talking about the interests of the global south. So again, it feels like it's always about how do we develop the global north, you know, so it's kind of the same thing, which is really frustrating.
I'll just say that it's very important that you are all here. And I think this year we had the biggest delegation of young people, I think 50 young people in the forum, and I can feel the difference. It's my 4th Davos, and I think it's so important to open to let's say, those that can speak truth to power, but that also can teach, because you have a lot to say and we have to absorb. So thank you for being here. I think it's very important that you're here. So can I take a question from you?
First of all, I want to thank you all for being amazing world ambassadors. So I work in the observatorium here in Davos. We measure essential climate variables. We do climate modeling, predicting what's going to happen. We have contributed to the IPCC report. And as all of you know, you see this frustratingly slow response. We know the science has been there for decades. We know what's happening. Is there anything we can do as scientists to communicate that more clearly? Because for us, it's a done deal. We know what's happening, but somehow we still have people who don't accept that climate change is happening. They could be senior politicians, or they could be your neighbor. How do we convince them better?
Very important question. And I'll just add to this question, because I see this mismatch, because their leaders already know, many of them, not most, they know, like deep inside they know, but there's this pressure on development, on political gains. So just adding to you, how do you feel also that we could support local leaders to be less, let's say, pressured by the needs of today? Because the long-term thinking is what we need to strike better, just making sure the people that need most are not unassisted in the present time, because the needs are already absolutely like out of scale.
I would just like to say to that, you know, when you just present data, it can mean nothing to somebody. But I think there needs to be stories attached with that data. And I think that Indigenous peoples would be perfect people for that. So yeah, that's how I answer your question.
If I may add, so I'm an Alliance of Small Island States fellow based in New York. So I'm based, this year I'm learning about negotiations. So being in the room when climate policy, ocean policy, sustainable development policy is being formulated, let's put it in that diplomatic way. I think it's interesting because I think scientists and lawyers need to be a strong partnership, because the science is clear, but there's many lobbyists, well-funded lobbyists, the people in power aren't necessarily scientists. It would be amazing to have more scientists be political leaders. I don't know how feasible and possible that always is, but I've seen amazing leaders be really evidence-based. And when you have evidence, when you have this, you know, not just for your 2 terms or 4 years, 8 years, whatever it may be, you know, for your children, your grandchildren, your state. It's a tricky situation because I think the science is clear, but who's in the room when the science is being fought over to make policy that is then meant to inform action? In Seychelles, it's an interesting situation. I think it's already been said that, you know, Africa is less than 4% in terms of contributions to greenhouse emissions. Small island states like Seychelles, it's 0 point, and the zeros keep going to 1. Yet, because other countries are not delivering on what that's been promised, exploration of oil and gas becomes more favorable, especially after a pandemic. Seychelles is currently looking into that, and that's a terrible thing for our leaders to be put into. It's a terrible thing when we're also looking to other countries not to do the same. So why are they going into these? And I always have the idea that it's good intentions to keep people safe, I mean, but this is a mismatch with what is our reality and with science. So the scientists and lawyers in terms of partnerships, scientists, leaders is clear. And I think it's a case where if promises were kept, maybe, you know, we would be following the science a bit more. I think that's a long conversation, but I think that's part of it.
I can just echo what both of you said. I mean, if we say a bunch of numbers, they're really powerful statistics, and there are many people that, when they hear numbers, they're like, oh, okay, this is interesting. But when they hear stories, as you said, that is something that can touch people. And I think that is the role of everyone. We cannot say these statistics without actually creating a picture of what those statistics look like on the ground. And also what you said, I think, I guess a challenge that our generation is going to have is that if we're going to be leaders, we also got to be scientists. We also got to be leaders. We also have to be storytellers. And that's one issue today, that we have a bunch of people in office that have no idea what the science is. They have no idea what the reality on the ground is. And it's, that's why we are in this situation today. But yeah, should be, and we're open for collaboration with the scientific world, both from the youth, from indigenous people, and I think it's that type of leadership that we need today. And many times there is kind of this separation from the scientific world and kind of the activism world, and it should not be like that. So that is something that it's not hard to address.
Yeah, I also think that the science is really important, and there is a need to add stories to that, because climate change is beyond, it's more than data points and statistics. It's also about the people. So there's really a need to have the stories of people combined together with the science in order to communicate what is happening. But also there is a need for media to help really amplify, the science, and also amplify the stories. We saw that, with the pandemic, media was really reporting the science that was given when it came to the pandemic and the different stories. So I think that there is a need for media to do the same thing for the climate, to really communicate the science and also communicate the stories. Media has a huge responsibility to talk about the climate crisis, but also talk about, the solutions that the communities are, demanding for.
Just adding to that, many times I hear the complaint that the data doesn't go back to the communities where research happens. So I think we have to be very aware of bringing information back to traditional populations, to indigenous groups, to the affected communities, because they many times don't know what's the result of the research that they participated. So unfortunately, we're getting to an end here. So what I would like to hear from these amazing panelists, 1 hour and a half was so fast, is just a key takeaway from the panel and a one-line message to world leaders. I know you already said, but just try to say something that kept in your mind that you would like them to take with them.
No, just thank you all for this very interesting conversation. I think you're all very good examples of what leadership looks like, and what it should look like in office also. I think something that I've been thinking about throughout this whole panel is that why, and something that I always think about when I have these spaces, what is it that I can say that can convince these people to stop and to change? What is it that has not been said yet that we can say? We have told stories, we have cried, we have exposed the issues, the scientific world has exposed the numbers, the statistics, the realities. What is it that can be done? And I think we're still in search for that, because we're trying everything and we're still not seeing the actions that we want to see. And something else that I hear about these stories of in my country, governments is investing in fossil fuel again, and in other countries as well. And for me, that is, all these governments and political leaders committed to the Paris Agreement, but then obviously they do not do that. So why do they commit to something that they are betting on to fail? They are betting on the Paris Agreement to fail, and that means to fail the entire planet. I don't have an answer for that, but that's something that's been on my mind for this entire panel. Why do they choose to bet on failure?
I think you gave a message when you started. You said, stop, just divest, get out of fossil fuel. So turn words into action. So I think she started with that message, and let's keep it. So Cassidy, please.
Yeah, exactly. You don't know what else you can say, really. And I think it's just a lack of character. Leaders, they don't exploit the earth. They do what they can to benefit the earth and the people living in it. So I would just say, I don't know, maybe it should be on your conscience to think about, are you an actual leader? And if you feel like you aren't, then what do you need to do to change that?
Do the hard things. Nobody here, I think, on this panel believes what we're asking for is easy. I think that's none. But we want to build trust. We want to build relationships so that we can make commitments a reality. We want words turned into actions, but we cannot do that when people lie, whether it's from governments, whether it's from private sector, just for the sake of PR, because that is just going to make us less trust what is happening. So I think stop telling lies is key. I think, as we've said, leadership in terms of what that means and how we define it and how we measure that in terms of success is key. As someone involved in negotiations, I know every country, most countries have given NDCs, nationally determined contributions. I advise anybody to look up your own nationally determined contributions, especially in the developed countries, to really read and be informed by what is being negotiated on your behalf and see if you actually agree with those words. There are some things that are legally binding and some things that are non-legally binding in those agreements. But when you start going for a fine rush through these agreements, you see what is being negotiated on your behalf, your children's behalf, and the generations to come behalf. And if you're not happy with what's been negotiated, you need to reach out to your people, to your leaders, or become your leaders. So I think that's a key message for me, is be informed and take action from being informed.
Thank you, Vanessa.
I think for me, it's to really listen to the most affected people and areas.
Taylor?
I think it's that we often see citizens, youth leaders operating on a binary, either filled with hope without a plan or shame without commitment to change. And so I think instead of that, we need to hold the tension in the middle, which is holding responsibility for the mistakes made to date and making concrete plans for what to do about the future.
So much, Taylor. So I think it's about accountability, and these young people will hold us accountable. It's about leaders doing the right thing. So thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you for hearing these voices, and we just hope that their messages resonate much further and that we can see the change we need to see. Thank you so much.